uh, listening to these two fabulous authors speak. We are using Crowdcast, so if you decide you want to chat to someone, there's a chat function on the side. There is also a Q&A function on the side. So if you come up with a question while they're having their discussion and you don't want to, well, please don't throw it in the chat. Throw in things in the chat if you want to. But if you want to send a question to the Q&A part of the event, please just use that little question, that little conversation box with a question mark in it. And those of us watching will be able to send that question onto the chat. That's thank you for supporting a small bookstore. We do request that if you're here and you hear about this book and you're obsessed like you should be, because truly what an incredible story, buy it. There's a little link down at the bottom where you'll be able to purchase that book right now, and it'll come to you or be ready for pickup and all those exciting things. But those, we can talk about that later, and believe me, we will. For this moment, though, I'm excited to welcome first our conversation partner. Elijah Kinch Spector is a writer, dandy, and rootless cosmopolitan from the Bay Area who now lives in Brooklyn. KALYNA the Soothsayer is his first novel, and then the author for this event are both, oh Lord, okay. The Pomegranate Gate by Ariel Kaplan. And Ariel grew up outside of Washington, D.C., where she's calling in from now, and spent most of her childhood reading fairy tales and mythology before settling on a deep love for Jewish folklore. She began studying the history of medieval Spain and the Convivencia while working on a Monroe Scholar project at the College of William and Mary, where she graduated with a degree in history and religious studies. She's the author of several books for younger readers, but The Pomegranate Gate is her first fantasy novel. So excited to see what else comes from her in the space. So here we go. I'm going to bring them in and I'm going to disappear. And it'll be hopefully a lot of fun because I won't be on the screen for you all. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to send these two, oh gosh, back up. And it's going great. And I'm disappearing. Oh, why? And I'm disappearing. Goodbye. Have a great time. And I'll see you later.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so Ariel, first of all, Mazel Tov on your book being out in the world. It's amazing. I was very lucky to get to read an early copy. Like, just first of all, just like, how does that feel having it out, having it done, and how long were you like working on it till it came out?
I've been saying about the rough draft was about 2 years. The reality is it was longer than that because it was started and then stopped and then started again. So it was 2 years from the time I started working on it in a meaningful way. It doesn't feel done because I'm writing the second one. I just turned in the revision for the second one, and now I need to be working on the third one. So it feels very much like it's still in process. Yeah.
Sure, yeah, I can imagine. I'm also working on revisions for a second book right now. Yeah, so I mean, and you know, I think that I kind of caught me about your bio is that you've written a lot of YA. So I was sort of curious, like, what are sort of the differences in moving from YA to, I guess, adult fiction? You know, what challenges, surprises, and just also in terms of the actual craft of writing it, like how does that process different?
Yeah, I think some of it is the difference between YA and adult, and some of it is the difference between writing contemporary novels versus sort of a more like epic fantasy. The scope of it is so much bigger. You know, there's a difference in when you can get away with a lot of sort of writing off the cuff when your book is only 300 pages long, and when you're writing a 550 something page doorstop, and then you know there's going to be 2 sequels, you can't do that as well. You're just in the weeds all the time. So I had to be very strict with myself about keeping an outline, and which had to be very detailed. And I constantly had to go back and keep updating it because I often didn't necessarily follow the outline, but at least I needed to have it so I kind of knew where things were going. The thing that I really liked about writing adult, which I had not done before, is being able to have a bigger diversity of ages and point of view characters without having to worry about do these kids sound 17 or do they sound like a 40-year-old trying to sound 17? And
Right.
in the Pomegranate Gate, I get to have, characters who were 30 and characters who were 80, and that's was very much fun to write. I really enjoyed
Right.
doing that.
Yeah, and also I assume that a character who is 17 doesn't need to sound like they're 17 now in like 2023, right?
Right.
I'll also just very quickly say, as somebody who has written a big doorstop fantasy novel, I unfortunately did pretty much half-ass it and like make it up as I went, and it's been a problem. But
It's okay when you're drafting. The problem for me is when you have to go back and make changes
yes,
and you realize that,
yeah, and yeah,
Yes.
like there were definitely so many times where I feel like editor would go like, so what did this mean? I have no idea. Anyway, so I mean, I guess I got a little bit of this also from your bio, but I was curious why the book, and I guess why your early study was specifically focused on Sephardi like folklore, because I feel like in our popular culture, unfortunately, Judaism is like Jewish history and Jewish folklore that we get to see in books and TV and movies generally in Ashkenazi, which for people who are watching who might not know the difference, Ashkenazi Jews are people whose families are from Eastern Europe. Sephardi Jews are usually their families were from like Spain and North Africa, right? That's the very short, very abbreviated version of that. But I sort of wondered like what drew you to that in the first place, and what made you decide to write the book about this?
Well, sort of the pre-expulsion period of Spanish history, the period, the Islamic period, was something that was interesting to me even from high school.
Yeah.
I was probably in the 10th grade when I wrote a paper about how Arabic translators in southern Spain were instrumental in transmitting classical Latin and Greek knowledge to the rest of Europe, and were sort of responsible in effect for the Renaissance. And so that part of history has been really interesting to me since I was really pretty young. When I went away to college, I was lucky enough to study a semester in Sevilla, and they had, at the place I was studying abroad, actual classes in very specifically Islamic Spain and Sephardi Spanish history. And so I was able to sort of get into it a little bit more. At that time, it was a little bit harder to find those kinds of history classes at a regular American university. They were a little bit more niche, like in terms of undergraduate studies. But that's always been really interesting to me, just that whole period. And I think it's sort of understudied in the US, even now, maybe less than it was when I was in college. But I fortunately kept all my books. And of course, there's been new stuff published since then. So, and I have always thought I would really, really like to write something, a historical novel or historical fantasy that takes place in that period. But for a long time, I really felt like I didn't have the chops to do it. I couldn't even figure out, where to fill up the holes in terms of what the research that you really can't do, because there are questions that we can't answer, especially for Jews in Spain. There's a lot of stuff that we don't have records of. So I felt like I don't know how to make that up. I don't know how to deal with that whole issue. So I kind of couldn't figure out a way in until I had the idea for sort of Toba and her part in the Gate many, many years ago. And then again, didn't know how to continue until I much later had the idea that it needed to be a dual narrative with something that was more grounded in the real world.
Got it. Yeah. Well, so that goes right perfectly into the next thing I was going to ask about. So because the book is largely set, it's largely split between like these two sort of main settings, right? There's like the mortal world, and then there's the Mazic world, which we'll get to that in a second. Let's start with the mortal world. And right away I was, and also the reason why I thought about this also based on what you were saying is because you were talking about, where do we fill the holes of the things we don't know? And what grabbed me right away about sort of the mortal world side of the story, the real world-ish side of the story, was that sort of ish, where it's like set in a place that didn't exist, but like within the first few pages, the Rambam, a very famous actual rabbi who existed, is like mentioned. So, a part of my brain was like, okay, so this isn't secondary world fantasy, but this also isn't exactly historical, and it's in this wonderful kind of folkloric, mythic in between that I really, really liked. And you know, I was sort of so I mean, I feel like you maybe already sort of answered this, but, you know, I what did you come to that idea partly because of this, like, there's too much we don't know, so
That was part of it, and also part of it was I wanted to have a little bit more freedom to mess with the timeline, and I
yeah,
wanted to have more freedom to mess with the geography, and I didn't want to have
yeah.
to answer questions like, why is Majorca in the wrong place? And how long would it have taken to go from here to here? And wait, the Inquisition didn't come to Portugal quite that early, like that. And
Right.
I wanted to be able to, but also I wanted it to feel more like a fantasy. I wanted it to
Mhm.
feel like a very big folktale more than a historical novel.
Yeah, yeah, and that's that. Yeah, and I love that piece of it, like that's sort of, you know, it sort of put me kind of off balance in a very good way, where I was sort of like not sure exactly how much was real, like how much was our real world and how much wasn't, and I liked that tension. But speaking of not our real world, there's also the Mazic world, which, first of all, maybe can you just describe what that is to people who haven't read the book yet?
Okay,
Um,
so where to start? So the Mazics in the Pomegranate Gate are sort of a race of immortal, magic wielding, semi-Jewish people. They kind of think they're Jews, but the Jews kind of are like, are you sure? So they live in sort of like a mirror version of our world, where events that happen in the human world are sort of strangely mirrored there in a way that is not entirely understood, and in a way that causes a lot of problems for the Mazics, as you can imagine. They live at the time of the Pomegranate Gate, they live in 11 cities, which are sort of mirror versions of it's a Mediterranean-centric world, basically. And so they're a sort of a dark mirror. You have to imagine, when you're thinking about the city that they're all in, is Ramon. So there's a mortal Ramon and a Mazic Ramon. And Mazic Ramon is, you have to imagine, what would it look like in sort of a 15th century autocratic Spanish city in a world where the rulers, there was very little regime change because people don't die and because people can have magic.
Right. Yeah, and I so first of all, I have other questions about it, because I loved the way that this world was sort of drawn in the book. But first of all, I wanted to know, like, how much of that came from existing folklore and how much of it did you invent whole cloth? Because, like, I have to admit, like, I was reading it like, this feels folkloric, but I don't know any of this stuff, which doesn't mean that I don't know everything, certainly. But, you know, I was very curious how much of that was sort of original and how much of that.
Mix.
Sorry?
There's a pretty big mix in terms of what I made up and what was already there. So, I mean, there are a lot of, I'm using the word loosely, demons in Jewish folklore. And that can mean a lot of different things. There's definitely a lot of demons who act pretty much like people, and who believe they're Jewish. That part is very well documented in folklore. The idea of these specific cities with the gates, that part is me.
Sure.
But there are other elements also that are really pulled from folklore. The idea of the Z's, the giant bird that can blot out the sun, that's from folklore.
That one I knew.
The stories of the sort of the lost city of Luz, where no one can die until they go outside of the wall of the city. That's straight out of folklore as well.
Oh wow, I haven't heard that one. That's fascinating. I love that. I hadn't heard about the demons who think they're Jewish thing, and I love that, and I want to learn more about this separately. But
you should go. There are some Talmudic stories. Do you know Rabbi? Now I'm losing my train of thought because it's late at night. Bar Hana. He was a Babylonian sort of. He's like Sinbad the Sailor, except he's a rabbi.
This is something that, like, anybody who knows me will be shocked that this is a thing that existed this long and I didn't know about it. But no, that's new to me.
Go and look up the stories about Bar Hana. It's, you know, there's stories that, like, he's on the ship going and seeing the world, and he crashes, and here are all of these demons flying around him, and they introduce themselves, and they're like, yeah, by the way, we're Jews. This is in the Talmud, by the way. And so
I haven't read enough Talmud, but I'm like, I have to look this up, right? I wrote it down.
There's all kinds of, like, wild stories. So I will tell you, my biggest inspiration was Howard Schwartz is a Jewish folklorist who writes, I mean, mostly they're like considered children's books.
Hmm.
And he has just volumes and volumes and volumes of folklore from all over the world,
Mm.
every time period. And he does a really good job of documenting where the different stories come from. You can also, if you go and read his footnotes, figure out like, okay, well, this story originated in Persia, and then there's this later version
Mm.
here, and then it, sort of transmutes according, like across many hundreds of years. Those books are really stupendous.
Mm.
I love those books. I loved them when I was a kid. I love them now.
Cool.
So
Writing that
yes,
down too.
highly recommend.
Yeah, no, the Barbarhana I did not know. But if you ever are curious, if anyone's ever curious about like times the Baal Shem Tov fought werewolves, I know a lot about that.
Oh yeah, yeah, all kinds of stuff like that. Yes.
Yeah. So a thing that I particularly liked about the Mazik world, and that was I think so interesting because I wasn't sure how much of it was pre-existing and how much came from you, was I liked that it was so dreamlike, it was so surreal, but the rules were the rules, and when you learned them, they made sense, and which also felt very Jewish, where it's like there's going to be a million rules and they matter, and I like that because sometimes things that are dreamlike or surreal can kind of just have anything happen, and then what does anything matter? And here it all felt like concrete, but concrete in a way that I, as a reader, was still not fully understanding for a while in a way that was really exciting because there were clearly rules, right? And I really liked that. So I wanted to drill a little more into like kind of the specific magic rules and building all that and making that work, making that cohesive, right? Like how, I mean, again, like the thing that really struck me was there's a whole thing with lentils in the book, and they're very important. It's like, I was like, that feels like an old folklore thing, but maybe it's just something that you came up with that feels like an old folklore thing.
Yeah, no, that was me making it up because I thought.
Well, you tricked me. So, but in a more general sense, like how did you make that internally cohesive? How did you make that work? Did you write out all the rules beforehand? Did you have the plot first and then go, okay, what will make the plot happen? Like, how did?
Oh gosh, there was some of both. I mean, I definitely thought a lot about what the rules were going to be.
Yeah.
A lot of it also evolved to sort of the plot.
Mm-hmm.
And some of it, came about in revisions because I would get an email from my editors saying, you have to explain this because this doesn't make sense. So there was a combination of different ways that ended up on the page. I did, originally have the idea that part of Toba is sort of one of the two main protagonists. Part of her problem there was going to be that she doesn't really understand how the magic works because it doesn't work the way she thinks it should based on being like a Jewish person.
Right. Yes. It is, I feel like it is difficult now to write like a new take on like person learning magic, but you really did. Like it really was like not like anything like that I'd read before, and I really loved that a lot.
I appreciate that. Yeah, no, I was worried about retreading that because it definitely is something that's been written about.
Yeah. I also, something that really jumped out at me, and I'm going to try to not be too spoilery here, but there are flashbacks about a character's like background. I'll just say that have that where the magic elements in that were so, I found them so sort of unsettling in like a really cool way. And that sort of reminded me, and I don't know, if anything influenced that, but it sort of reminded me of stories about like the Buddha as a kid, or like old infancy gospels that are apocryphal in Catholicism or something, where these things about like a child who is otherworldly in a way that's not cute, but is like kind of terrifying. And I was wondering like what influenced that, or
it wasn't. I was a religious studies major, so I have definitely read a lot of that stuff.
Right.
So it wasn't consciously influenced that way, but now that you have said it, it probably was.
Love that.
It was definitely like me trying to sound very much like these old stories in those flashbacks.
Yeah, and I think old stories like that are often yeah, they can sometimes be very unsettling in a way we're not used to in sort of modern fantasy, and I really liked those elements a lot. It felt like ancient, in that sort of way, which is really wonderful. To shift a little bit, especially in the real world parts of the book, the mortal world parts of the book, you're also dealing with a lot of really like heavy stuff, right? Like, even though it's technically a fictitious country, it is very much about very real persecution that happened. And I was sort of wondering, how did you go about balancing that with the like fun fantasy adventure that is also part of the book? This is also a kind of selfish question because that's a line I'm always trying to walk myself,
That was probably the thing I was the most worried about the whole time I was
Mhm.
writing, and it really slowed me down a lot because I would be
Mm.
writing this and thinking, is this okay? Like, is this sensitive to the subject matter? And I spent a lot of time thinking, and what I eventually had to decide is there are going to be people who read this who don't like all of it, and I
Yeah,
just sort of had to accept that that was the reality.
for sure. Yeah. I mean, I thought the balance worked really well. And yeah, there were parts of the book that really were like, oh, this is real intense stuff. But then there's also parts that's like, oh, eat all the magical fish that you made. And those both could like coexist. I really
Right.
enjoyed a lot.
Well, it's interesting because before I wrote this, I read a lot of books about the sort of novels that took place during the Inquisition, which there isn't quite as much Inquisition as in a lot of these books. But a lot of them, you can tell who the author was based on how much the Jewish characters suffer. In that, there's a lot of in a lot of those books, the Jewish characters don't get the chance to be the hero, and they don't
Right.
get the chance to have a lot of agency. And I really, really did not. Those kinds of books tend not to be written by Jewish people, where it tends to be
Right.
sort of like the boy in the striped pajamas, except that it's the Inquisition. If you see what I'm saying, and so
I was pretty much thinking of that. Yeah.
yeah, I wanted to write a book where, like, the, pretty much all of the main characters are Jews, it, depending on whether you include the Mazics in that or not, and they get to be clever and have adventures and romance and all of those things.
Yeah. Yeah. I also what was I gonna say? Um, shoot, I lost it. Well, that's okay.
Come back to you
No,
in
I
an hour.
I'm sorry.
We'll come back to you in about an hour. You'll think.
Yeah. No, I'll get there. But it's I was so close to something. All right. Well, while I think of that, I am instead going to ask you a pretty like just a fun, straightforward question, which is like, who was your favorite character? Who was the most like fun to write as a character? I know my favorite character is kind of spoilery to mention, but it's sort of Toba. But
Yeah, she's sort of Toba is a
yeah,
lot
yeah.
of fave. Yeah, I had several that were very fun to write. I quite like writing dialogue. Even when I was writing YA, that was always my favorite part to write. So anything with Barzilay, who is one of the sort of main Mazics in it, because he gets a lot of fun dialogue, he gets to be charming and he gets to be funny. Any scene with him in it was very easy to write. Any scene with the old woman, who is a human character, was
Oh
very
yeah.
right. Yeah, a lot of it had to do with just who was in the scene, because anytime, usually where there's a lot of sort of inner monologue, that tends to be a little bit harder for me, and it
Hmm.
tends to take a little longer. The dialogue sort of writes itself.
Sure. Now if you have strong characters, that can sort of, I think, feel like come out in that way. I remembered what my other question was going to be, so going back to before about sort of mixing real world things and fantasy things, which was um a tricky thing to do, I feel like, is to take, it's one thing to have the real world awful thing and you have the fantasy thing, but mixing them, like there was, so the Inquisition is in this book, and there is an evil magical thing that is connected to it.
Mhm.
But I what I liked was that you made it very clear in the book that, oh, this isn't a thing where, oh, the people who were in the Inquisition were actually innocent and some evil demon came and made them do the bad thing, which is a thing you see sometimes in pop culture, usually in things written by people who are on the privileged side of whatever it's about. And I thought that was a thread that I really felt you sort of walked very well. I don't know if that was something you were thinking about consciously or if it was just sort of like obvious.
I definitely didn't want to let anybody off the hook.
Yeah.
Things that actually happened. Yeah, no, and definitely, I don't think it's very spoilery because it happens in the very beginning of the book where one of the nastier Mazics goes to the head inquisitor of Spain and says, I'm going to help you out, but I want all of books of the Jews of Spain. Everything bad that was going to happen was already in the process of happening. He was just capitalizing on it.
Yeah, and that was I noticed that immediately and really appreciated it because the moment I saw that guy show up, there was a voice in my head that was like, "This isn't gonna let them off." It was like, "No." You know, that's because there's definitely I guess I'm not as familiar with it in terms of stories about the Inquisition, but certainly in like Holocaust stories, you get that a lot where it's like, oh, the Jews are there to sort of suffer, and obviously this isn't only with Jews. You get this a lot in a lot of like things, Hollywood movies about black people, like that are written by white people, right? It's the same sort of thing of just like, oh, they are there to be acted upon and to feel bad for, but not.
Yeah. It's so that somebody else can feel heroic by saying
exactly.
Yeah, and I definitely did not want to do that.
Yeah. And also to your point about like Jews going to do more interesting things. I also there's a really wonderful sort of dream gay romance that I really, really enjoyed in the book a lot, personally. So yeah. I thought that was really wonderful. Well, you already talked a bit about some things that kind of inspired you in terms of the folklore side. Are there any like things more on the fantasy side that influenced you, or something completely different, unrelated, that still did somehow?
Let's see. Well, I started reading fantasy, as a child, like yourself, I'm sure. But it wasn't, I was walking through a bookstore and I came across a copy of Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. And it was, face out with a card underneath. And I picked it up and I started reading it and I thought, oh, like people are actually publishing Jewish fantasy now. And I'm sure it was not like the first one, but it was the first one that really sort of caught the way that it did. And that was really exciting to me that a book like that could sort of catch in a mainstream audience. And after I read that was very exciting. This idea that, oh, okay, like we can do more than Cinderella now. Like that was very fun.
Yeah.
So that one definitely was a big inspiration. The other one that I found in a similar way was The Golem and the Jinni by Helene Wecker, which is it's historical fantasy. That one feels more like historical, I think.
Yeah.
But it's so unique in that way because it feels very much like, well, obviously there's a golem living, in 1900 New York. Like it just seems like you believe everything that happens in that book.
Right.
Which I found really remarkable.
Yeah. I know that's an interesting comparison point because again, like, your book I feel like is balancing these real world things and, to the point where there were points where I was reading it and I thought like, I'm not that familiar with, Spain and North Africa at this time. Maybe these are real places. And then I'd look it up like, oh, no. But, like, it's like, could be, right? It's, so you mentioned that this is the first in a trilogy.
Yes.
So what can you tell us about the second book that isn't, too spoilery?
Well, what I can tell you about the second book, which like it has a beginning and a middle and an end now, so that's exciting. And it has a cover.
That's a good start.
It has a cover, so like we're that far along, so that's very exciting. It has a sort of a bigger landscape than book one. Book one takes place pretty much entirely inside Sepharad in the city of Ramon. Book two expands the greater world, and so you see the characters traveling outside of Spain. So that part is expanded. There are a few new characters, but mostly it is our heroes who are, again, trying very hard to not get killed because that's what they do, and having adventures and romances and so forth. And it's hard to be spoilery because without talking about the end of book one.
That was almost more what I meant than about like, yeah. Well, I mean, the question that comes to mind from that immediately that wouldn't be spoilery is what parts of the world do they go to, and like what sort of, if you can talk about it, like if you feel, you know, like what are the sort of real or based on real settings that you're sort of playing in book two?
Well, the major setting outside of Sephiroth for book two, I suppose I can talk about, is Zait, which is, I will show you the map.
Ooh, excellent.
Okay. So
this map is so beautiful too.
This map is beautiful. I don't know if it's going to flip it. No, it's good.
No,
so you can see Zait is right there.
Got it.
Italy, and it is somewhat an analog to Venice/Florence, which of course at this period, you know, like right around 1500 is going through the Renaissance. So that is sort of the main setting outside. It's not the only setting. It's the setting I can tell you that isn't spoilery.
Works. That's great. No, that's wonderful. I'm just like, I'm very excited to see sort of what the other places in the book are. Do you, and you mentioned it's a trilogy, like how much do you plan ahead? You mentioned outlining. Do you know where it's all going, or are you sort of like
how it ends? I knew how it ended from very early on, mostly, except that there was a very significant character that was not in the original outline.
Can you tell me who, or is that?
Neither Elena nor the old woman were in the original outline, so they were added as I was drafting, and then I made a lot of changes after that. So they're still in book two. I can tell you that much.
Excellent. The old woman was also a favorite of mine. She's actually surprisingly similar to a old woman in my book. Not to the point of like, but it's just like, oh, we clearly had similar things on our brains of like this kind of character.
or we knew similar people.
Could be. Yeah. No, that's
not a real person, except that maybe a little bit.
Yeah, a little more. It's just like you kind of expand them a little bit.
Yeah.
What are you reading right now? Anything, whether like just fiction that you're enjoying or something that's research for?
Let's see if it's yeah, I have been doing a lot of research.
Yeah.
What am I reading right now? I'm drawing a blank. It was I just started, and I said this in an event like 2 weeks ago, but that shows you like how slow I am. The Heaven and Earth grocery store. And so I'm trying to sort of, now that I have my revision turned in, I'm like, okay, I'm going to actually sit down and like read this all the way through instead of just reading like a couple of chapters and then being like, no, I have to go back and rewrite something. So yeah, I try when since I'm in the middle of doing all this sort of high fantasy stuff, to read some stuff that is not that.
Yeah.
To try to sort of keep myself a little bit mentally fresh.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's very important to read outside of your genre, especially when you're writing in that genre. It can really help you to do something that, isn't like what everyone else is doing, right? Yeah, so those are pretty much all the questions I have, but I see one question that somebody sent in, which was, what was the process for designing the map like? And I only just did this myself very recently, so I'm curious how that was for you.
Well, we had the conversation was what needed to go on it, and so I had already. If you, I don't know, people may not have seen the book. There was a list of locations, like in the formatter, and so I had to take that list. And what I did basically was I printed a blank map, the internet, and then I marked where stuff was supposed to be so that people would know. And then it was a matter of deciding, okay, well, we want to have one map that's sort of locally like Sephiroth, and then another one that shows all of the gate cities. So yeah, I kind of mocked something up, but my version did not look like this. It did not have any of the art on it. It was just, pins basically.
Yeah, mine was literally the artist, I think, referred to it as a napkin sketch, which it wasn't literally, but that's what it looked like. Like I really just scribbled something on like a note page, and I think I did draw one little like stick figure on it somewhere, but like it was not an artist. But the map is beautiful. Like everyone saw it a little bit. I like it, so when I read the book a few months ago, it was an early version. It didn't have the cover, it didn't have the map, and so seeing the map when I got like my nice real version was just it's absolutely beautiful. Everyone are really great about design stuff.
Yeah,
in my experience.
Yeah,
I don't see any other questions for us at the moment. Let's see if I can. Or is there anything else about the book you'd like to talk about? Like anything that you'd especially like to drive home about it?
Well, I hope people read it.
Yeah,
I hope people
me
enjoy
too.
it. I really wanted to write something that felt like the stories that I had really loved when I was a kid.
Yeah,
And so that's what I'm hoping that this will feel like to people. It will feel like sort of a large scale fairy tale.
yeah. Well, it definitely works in that sense. Like I said, like I'm amazed at the things that I assumed were maybe actual old myth that turns out you made up. So like it definitely does that very well. And it's funny. I feel like you were talking earlier about like there'd been other Jewish fantasy, but not that much. I feel like in at least in my understanding, like I can think of a lot of Jewish leaning science fiction, but I feel like fantasy is often a genre that we're not kind of in as much. I don't know if this has been your experience as well, though it kind of sounds like what you were saying before. I don't know if you have an idea as to why that might be. It's something I think about a lot and I don't have an answer for.
Yeah, well, there was. You'll have to forgive me because I cannot remember who wrote it, but there was an editorial that written a couple of years ago about where, like, it was talking about the Jewish Narnia, like where is the Jewish Narnia, and
Mm,
the explanation that was given by the gentleman who wrote the article, and I'm sorry I can't tell you who it was that history has a lot of fantasy tends to be backwards looking historically, and history has not
mm,
really been like super great
right.
for Jewish people, and so like it's hard to write something like that and have it not just be like sad, suffering
Right.
Jews. Uh,
Right.
so, and
Yeah.
where science fiction you is looking forward, and so you get to be Captain Kirk on Starship.
Right. Yeah, there is some inherent like not always obviously, but fantasy can lean conservative in that way, in that sort of
Mhm.
backward looking way for sure. Um yeah, I guess yeah, I mean if what your fantasy is it's always like Western Europe and knights and feudalism, it's like, well, that was certainly not a good place for us.
Right, right.
um here's another question. Do you have any character or part of the plot that surprised you while you were writing the book?
Oh, well, yeah, like a lot of it was surprising to me because so the original Naphtali chapters, that whole sequence was kind of weak because he, Elena was not supposed to be there. The old woman originally was supposed to show up for like one scene and tell him that his parents were dead and then leave. And like and then I realized, okay, this is not good for this kid to be walking around. And also it didn't, from a narrative perspective where you had sort of there's a mirror to these narratives, and so on Toba's side, you have Toba with her two Mazik friends. Naphtali also had to have sort of a similar sized group, and so for
Mm,
him to be wandering around by himself made no sense. But yeah, so those characters surprised me a little, and also other people's reactions to them surprised me a little.
mm.
People liked the old woman more than I thought that they would, and people disliked Elena more than I thought that they would.
That's interesting. That's interesting. I don't remember disliking Elena, but I definitely was like, oh, old woman definitely struck me as the kind of character that you might have been like, oh, she'll be in a couple scenes, and then I could see where you'd be like, no, this is too good to not keep using, which is always great when it surprises you in that way. I feel like,
No, and it was surprising to me that how much fun it was to get to write those two characters.
yeah,
Because there aren't a lot of very active geriatric characters, and usually it's like the old mentor who, like, you know, like they
Right.
live on top of the mountain and they give advice and then you never see them again. And the old woman and Elena are very much like in the thick of the plot.
Active. Yeah. I like that a lot. And I wonder if, I wonder if that was also part of what you were talking about earlier about moving away from YA and getting to write about more people. Like, you probably didn't want to write just about a bunch of young adults who were, having an adventure, because you've done that.
Yeah, no, it was definitely, it also, I felt like it made for a sort of a richer story to be able to have the same events sort of described by a little bit of a more mature character, because the main characters are very idealistic and
Right.
very sheltered, and Elena and the old woman are very much not that. They've
Right.
seen stuff.
Yeah. No, I liked the moments of like selfishness that they had too at times, both of them, as I remember it, of just like, in ways where it's like, yes, I am old, I know what the world is, we need to do this. I don't, I appreciated those sorts of moments very much. Another question we have here is, does writing about a thoroughly researched period in history make the process harder, or does it take away from the sort of blank page stress of starting the book?
Oh, that's a hard question. See,
Yeah.
with this, there are so many question marks. I mean, it's researched, but also there's a lot of things people don't know. So one of the summers I was working on this was mostly written during sort of COVID, during the pandemic.
Okay. Gotcha.
And there is a professor up at SUNY Binghamton who teaches Ladino classes online. And so I took some, I think two of his classes, and now I'm blanking on his name, but I can look it up in a minute. I'm not going to look it up right now. But I asked him the question. I said, well, so like what were, I mean, I'm assuming the Jewish people in Spain were speaking sort of the vernacular language at home, right? And he said, maybe.
Oh.
Like it's,
Yeah.
we don't have, he said it like, we don't really know exactly what people were speaking everywhere, but yeah, we think that's probably what people were having. That's what was happening based on the development of Ladino later.
Right.
But, the idea that we know exactly how people were living back then, there's a lot of gaps.
Yeah.
So that part was hard because you don't want to be wrong,
Yeah. No, it's.
If I answered it.
Yeah, I mean, but then also especially when you're playing in this sort of mostly but not all the way historical, then like what is wrong, right? You can kind of just...
no, and also how can I put this? Like you don't want to be too accurate in a historical like you don't want to be writing in where everybody's got like no teeth and syphilis. Like that's not fun. So.
Right. Or or where very, or where certain people might be like a little too hateful against various minorities. Again, there's like a queer thing in the story that I liked very much, and like that's something where I feel like you probably had to like possibly, or may in the future have to sort of elide what historical feelings on that would be. But yeah. I don't know if there are any other questions. Yeah. Nope, those are all part of the ones we've already answered. Let's see. Like I'm really, again, like I guess tell me more about like, so I know you already had researched a lot of this stuff, but what sort of things were you specifically using as your research, like for this book, knowing what you already knew, but also knowing you were going to make up a lot of it? Like what were the sort of things you were reading? Like you were saying earlier about how little we know, like how many contemporary like sources do we even have, versus...
Well, I mean, that's sort of the sad thing, is a lot of the written stuff that we have about how Jewish people were living in this period in Spain come from the Inquisition records.
Right.
That's what we have. I think I did an event last week or the week before where I talked about, I came across a cookbook, and I thought it was going to be, more like sort of old Sephardi recipes, but that's not what it was. It was recipes, they were the original old Jewish recipes, and the reason we have them is because the Inquisition made records of, okay, well, this family is eating this on Friday nights, which is how we know they're secretly Jews.
Right.
So we have all those records, right?
Yeah.
Which are, it would be nice if we had something else, but
Right.
difficult. Now I'm trying to remember what the rest of the question was.
Oh, no,
About other sources?
Yeah. Yeah, just like what other sources, but actually that also brings to mind a different question, which is when so much of what you're reading is like the information gathered by the Inquisition, like what's the mental toll of that, you know? Like how do you deal with that? Which is something I also deal with, yeah.
It's depressing. I mean, but
Yeah.
you kind of know going in that it's going to be terrible. So
Right.
the antidote to that was possibly there was a book that came out, I'm not sure how long ago, many years ago, called The Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean, all discussing sort of there were a number of Jewish pirates, a number of them had been Sephardi, and they ended up sort of in the Caribbean because they sort of had to go west to get away from the Inquisition, and they really, really, really loved sinking Spanish ships. That was their favorite.
Is that something that might show up in a later book?
Possibly.
Excellent. Love that very much. Yeah, I think that's I can't think of anything else at the moment. I feel like this has been really, really wonderful. Like I can't impress enough upon people. Like this is a great book. It is so different from other fantasy books that I've read in such interesting, fun ways. I really the way the magic worked were all things that like I'm not somebody like I love fantasy, but I'm not somebody who's usually like really into how a magic system works. But in this one, I really was because because of the way it kind of reminded me of old folklore and the way that I think in my blurb for your book, I think I actually used the word Talmudic.
Yes, I'm very excited about that. Yeah. Oh, so you got it.
Yeah. I although you have made me realize how little Talmud I've read. So
there's a lot that I don't know either. It's just that if you read a lot of folklore, that's where a lot of it comes from. And so there's a lot of folklore that like I read as a kid that I actually did not realize was Talmudic in origin until I went back and read it as an adult, and I actually read all the footnotes. So yeah, Go look at Howard Schwartz. I mean, his stuff is just it's the documentation is just incredible. Where everything comes from, it's amazing.
Yeah, no, I wrote that down. Definitely. But also if you ever do want to write something about the Baal Shem Tov fighting werewolves, let me know.
That's great. That would be amazing. I mean, there's that's the thing about Jewish folklore that I loved so much when I was a kid. It's just vast. And a lot of it is really weird. Yes. And a lot of it also feels really modern in a way that it's very sort of self-deprecating in a way you don't see in folklore. There's the couple and they had 3 sons and they were all idiots.
Actually, this just reminds me really quickly of something that I just think if you've probably heard of, but if not, you will appreciate very much, which is about a year ago I learned that there was in the I want to say the 17th century, there was a Yiddish Arthurian story written. Do you know about this?
No.
There's a Yiddish Arthurian story. Well, the book it's in is called Radiant Days, Haunted Nights. So maybe somebody can put a link to that in the chat. And it is an Arthurian story written in Yiddish, and it is an Arthurian story that never mentions England or Christianity. It's incredible. And the knights of Arthur and his knights do not live in Camelot; they live in Arthurtown, and it's incredible. Strongly recommend
this. So we're probably running out of time, but I will tell you there was one summer in college where I got a research grant. So at my school, you could get a research grant to do research in an area outside of your major.
Yeah.
Summer, it was like a cross-disciplinary fellowship, and I wrote a big paper about Arthurian literature as like a venue for social peace. This is what I did one summer because I really didn't want to get a job. So
Yeah.
that is something that I will have to go look up. That sounds
Yeah.
amazing.
So I don't think it's in print anymore, so I'm not sure if you can grab it, unfortunately, at Mysterious Galaxy. But it's called Radiant Days, Haunted Nights, and I strongly recommend it to anybody who's interested in this sort of thing. Anyway, and here's the book. It's beautiful. Love this cover.
I'm so sorry. I totally misread. I thought I was jumping in to be helpful, and then you all.
No,
you
were, and then we got on a tear, which is also good.
Yeah, no,
which
the cover is always a good thing. So
yeah,
that was. I mean, the tear at the end was great. I was loving it. I was trying to cover my face because I'm very expressive, but it was delightful. But I just wanted to say thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks
Also
so much for having me. That's great. And thank you, Elijah.
Yeah.
This entire conversation has just been so like restorative in ways and just really engaging and really exciting to listen to. And so I've been having the time of my life. And I just really wanted to, because our viewers can't say it, thank you. Because it really has been a treat. Oh no, did someone add another Q&A? No, someone just said thanks. Great.
Oh.
But I will just say it again, that if you've watched this whole event and you haven't already purchased the Pomegranate Gate, I'm unsure how. It was after you've heard all of this and you're like, oh, I'm not sure I need to read it. Yes, you do. Just to look at the map. Are you kidding? How have we not sold you on it?
Yeah, you definitely need that.
And you have to read it now so that when you have more to read, you already know what's going on. But
I should have asked, do you know about when book 2 is coming out?
Next fall.
Next fall.
Unless I get real slow, which
yeah.
Later, but
that might be around the same time my next book is coming out, actually. So that's
exciting.
Great. Well, we can do another event.
Next fall, then that'll be great.
Well, with that, I say thank you to all of the folks who joined us from home, and I'm gonna close this down, and you two will wind up in a green room with me.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.